You know what's funny about galactic civilizations? They have this adorable habit of assuming that just because they've figured out faster than light travel, they've also figured out everything else worth knowing. It's like watching a toddler who just learned to walk declare themselves ready for the Olympics. The Galactic Council, and yes, they actually called themselves that with a straight face, had been running things for about 3,000 years when humanity finally showed up to the party. 3 millennia of bureaucratic meetings, committee formations, and the kind of mind-numbing administrative processes that would make a DMV employee weep with envy. "Another primitive species requests admission," announced Counselor Vexthara, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's light in what probably passed for dramatic effect on her homeworld. "They call themselves humans." The assembled representatives performed their species equivalent of collective eye-rolling. The Zephyrians fluttered their membranes dismissively. The Karathi made that grinding noise with their carapaces that sounded like someone trying to start a broken lawnmower. Even the Etherians, who didn't technically have physical forms, managed to convey profound boredom through their energy signatures. "Let me guess," rumbled Counselor Thrax, his massive bulk causing minor seismic activity in the chamber floor. "They've discovered nuclear fission, think they're hot stuff, and want to play with the big kids?" "Actually," Vexthara consulted her data crystal with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list, "they claim to have something called railguns." The silence that followed was the kind you get when someone tells a joke so bad that even crickets refuse to chirp. It was a silence pregnant with the collective intellectual superiority of beings who had mastered antimatter propulsion, reality-bending technology, and interdimensional mathematics. "Railguns," repeated Counselor Zixlam, his tentacles writhing in what his species considered sophisticated amusement. "How quaint. Shall we inform them that we stopped using kinetic weapons around the time we discovered how to harness the cosmic forces of creation itself?" Now. Thrax's voice carried the patronizing tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow child. "We must be diplomatic. These humans are probably very proud of their little metal accelerators." And there it was, folks. The moment that would go down in galactic history as the underestimation heard round the galaxy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. David Kowalski, Dave to anyone who didn't want their teeth rearranged, stood on the bridge of the UES Thunderstrike and watched the Galactic Council's welcoming committee approach. The committee consisted of 3 ships that looked like someone had asked a committee of abstract artists to design military vessels while having a particularly bad acid trip. "Sir," called Lieutenant Torres from the communications station, "they're hailing us with what appears to be a children's song?" Dave raised an eyebrow. At 35, he'd seen enough weird stuff in his military career to know that the universe had a sense of humor, and it wasn't a particularly good one. "Put it through." The main screen flickered to life, revealing what looked like a cosmic Muppet convention. The lead alien, a being that resembled a cross between a jellyfish and a disco ball, was indeed singing, in what sounded like baby talk. "Greetings, little primitive species. Welcome to the big galaxy. Please don't touch anything sharp or you might hurt yourselves." Dave turned to his XO, Commander Harris, whose expression suggested she was seriously considering the benefits of early retirement. Are they talking to us like we're toddlers?" "Appears so, sir." "And they're doing it in song form?" "Affirmative, sir." Dave nodded slowly. "Right. Open a channel." He straightened his uniform and wore his best diplomatic expression, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes, and suggested that while he was being polite, he was also calculating the most efficient way to disassemble everything in the room. "This is Captain David Kowalski of the United Earth ship Thunderstrike. We appreciate your enthusiastic welcome. However, I should probably mention that we left our finger paints and juice boxes at home." The cosmic jellyfish's song faltered. "Excuse me? Oh, I'm sorry. Were we supposed to respond in nursery rhyme? Because I can do that. Mary, quite contrary, how do your assumptions grow? With silver bells and cockleshells and pretty maids all in a row? Of battleships armed with weapons that could turn your pretty light show there into expensive space debris." The transmission cut off abruptly. "Sir," Harris said, fighting back a grin, "I don't think that's how diplomatic first contact is supposed to go. Commander, in my experience, respect is earned, not given because someone asks nicely. And right now, I'm getting the distinct impression that they think we're some kind of galactic charity case." He wasn't wrong. 3 hours later, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session. Emergency sessions were rare, mostly because getting several hundred different species to agree on anything, including the definition of emergency, typically took longer than most actual emergencies lasted. "They insulted diplomatic envoy Blissthara," announced Counselor Vexthara, her crystalline form now pulsing an angry shade of vermilion. Called her a light show. Technically, interjected Counselor Nimrod, his digitized voice crackling through the chamber's speakers. They called her a pretty light show. I believe that was meant as a compliment. That's even worse. They think they can... Vexthara sputtered, which was impressive considering her species communicated through controlled light refraction. Can what? Thrax leaned forward, his interest piqued. In 3,000 years of council membership, he'd never seen Vexthara at a loss for words. What exactly did this human say? The chamber's central display activated, showing a recording of Dave's transmission. The assembled representatives watched in various states of confusion, amusement, and, in a few cases, what might have been grudging respect. He quoted primitive human literature, Vexthara said, her tone suggesting this was somehow worse than declaring war. And then he made threats. Did he, though? Counselor Zixlam's tentacles were now moving in the pattern his species used for deep contemplation. I analyzed the linguistic structure. He was making a statement of capability, not a threat of action. What's the difference? Demanded another counselor. A threat is, I will hurt you. A statement of capability is, I can hurt you, but I probably won't unless you give me a reason. Humans appear to understand the distinction. Thrax's deep rumble filled the chamber. You're overthinking this. They're a primitive species with primitive weapons. What possible threat could they pose to civilizations that have mastered the fundamental forces of reality? And that, dear readers, was question number 2 that would haunt galactic historians for centuries to come. Dave was studying the intelligence reports when the second diplomatic overture arrived. This time it wasn't a singing jellyfish. This time it was what appeared to be a 6-foot-tall lobster wearing the kind of ceremonial robes that suggested either deep religious significance or a profound lack of fashion sense. Captain Kowalski, the lobster being began, its translator rendering what were probably clicks and chittering sounds into overly formal English. I am Ambassador Clickstar of the Karathi delegation. I come bearing an offer of protection. Dave looked at Harris, who raised an eyebrow in the universal expression of, here we go again. Protection from what, Ambassador? Why, from the dangers of deep space, of course. Pirates, cosmic phenomena, accidentally flying into a star because you don't know any better. These things happen to developing civilizations. I see, and this protection would cost us? Oh, nothing too expensive. Perhaps exclusive mining rights to your asteroid belts. Trading concessions. A modest tribute of rare Earth elements. The usual. Dave nodded thoughtfully. Ambassador Clickstar, can I ask you something? Of course. How many developing civilizations have you extended this generous offer to? Clickstar's antennae twitched, probably their equivalent of a nervous smile. Oh, dozens, and they're all very grateful for our protection. And how many of these civilizations would you say developed past the point of needing protection? Well, that's not really. The point is that space is dangerous. Dave leaned back in his command chair. Ambassador, I'm going to tell you something that might come as a shock. We've been protecting ourselves for quite some time now. Hell, we've been protecting ourselves from each other for millennia, and let me tell you, humans can be real bastards when they put their minds to it. But surely you understand that there are threats out here that your primitive weapons simply cannot... Primitive? Dave's voice acquired that particular edge that Harris recognized as the precursor to spectacularly poor diplomatic decisions. Ambassador, would you like to see one of our primitive weapons? I suppose that would be educational. Dave's expression wasn't particularly reassuring. Fire control, this is the captain. Fire control, aye, sir. Please target that convenient asteroid approximately 50,000 kilometers off our starboard bow. Standard railgun, minimal charge. Aye, sir. Target acquired. Through the view screen, Ambassador Clickstar could see the asteroid in question, a decent-sized chunk of rock and metal that had probably been drifting through space since the solar system formed. It looked solid. It looked permanent. It looked like the kind of thing that would take some serious firepower to affect. Fire. For a fraction of a second, there was a brilliant flash of light as the railgun's magnetic accelerators sent a tungsten slug downrange at a significant percentage of the speed of light. The asteroid, which had been there for billions of years, suddenly wasn't. The quiet that followed stretched for several seconds. Ambassador, Dave said politely, you were saying something about primitive weapons? Clickstar's antennae were now doing something that the translation software couldn't quite parse, but which universal body language suggested meant, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. That was That was just a small asteroid, the ambassador finally managed. Yes, Dave agreed. That was minimal charge. Would you like to see what happens when we're actually trying? I think I need to report back to the council. You do that. Oh, and ambassador? Next time you want to offer someone protection, you might want to make sure they actually need it first. The emergency session that followed could have been titled 67 Different Ways to Say We May Have Fucked Up in Galactic Basic. Ambassador Clickstar's report had been illuminating. And by illuminating, the council meant absolutely terrifying in ways that challenged their fundamental understanding of how the universe worked. They vaporized an asteroid, Clickstar was saying for the 7th time. Not destroyed, not broken apart. Vaporized. There was literally nothing left but expanding plasma and some very confused cosmic dust. How much energy would that require? Asked Counselor Nymphy, her harmonious voice carrying just a hint of what her species considered panic. According to our sensors, Clickstar consulted his datapad with shaking claws. Approximately 47 terajoules, delivered instantaneously. The chamber fell silent. 47 terajoules was, well, it was enough energy to power a small city for a month. And these humans had just casually tossed that much firepower at a rock, because someone had called their weapons primitive. That's impossible, declared Counselor Vexthara, but her light patterns were flickering uncertainly. Kinetic weapons can't generate that kind of energy release. The physics don't work. Unless, Counselor Zixlam's tentacles were now writhing in what his species called the pattern of terrible realization. They've found a way to accelerate projectiles to relativistic velocities, which is theoretically impossible without massive power sources, Vexthara insisted. Theoretically, agreed Thrax. But these humans seem to have a habit of ignoring theory. Counselor Nymphy raised a harmonic that commanded attention. There's something else. Our deep space monitoring stations have been analyzing their ship signatures. These humans, they're not using antimatter drives. Fusion? Asked someone. No, something else. Something that generates power signatures we don't recognize. The pause that followed was the kind that usually preceded either profound discoveries or profound disasters. Sometimes both. I think, Thrax said slowly, we may need to reconsider our initial assessment of humanity. You think? Clickstar's translator was having trouble keeping up with his rapid-fire chittering. They have weapons that could punch holes through our dreadnoughts like they were made of tissue paper, and we offered to protect them. Calm yourself, Ambassador, Vexthara said, though her own light pattern suggested she was anything but calm. We are the Galactic Council. We have 3,000 years of experience in dealing with primitive species. Counselor? Zixlam's voice carried a note that his species reserved for pointing out obvious truths that others were missing. I don't think they're primitive. Back aboard the Thunderstrike, Dave was getting a crash course in galactic politics courtesy of the ship's AI, Aria. Unlike the cheerful, helpful AIs from science fiction, Aria had been programmed by actual military personnel, and consequently had the personality of a particularly sarcastic drill sergeant. So let me get this straight, Dave said, rubbing his temples where a headache was forming. The Galactic Council has been running a protection racket for 3,000 years? That's a somewhat reductive but essentially accurate assessment, Captain, Aria replied in her crisp, vaguely British accent. They identify primitive civilizations, offer protection from galactic threats, and in exchange receive tribute in the form of resources, technology, and labor. And nobody's ever called them on this? Several species have attempted to resist. The results were unfortunate. Define unfortunate. Complete societal collapse, usually. The Council has a doctrine of graduated response that begins with economic isolation and typically ends with what they term humanitarian intervention. Dave studied the tactical displays showing the positions of Council ships throughout the local systems. And they think they can do this to us? Based on their previous encounters with species at similar technological levels, yes. Captain, I should note that their confidence isn't entirely misplaced. The Council fleets are equipped with weapons and defenses based on technologies we don't fully understand. But they appear to operate under the assumption that all species follow similar technological development paths. They expect energy weapons, deflector shields, and faster-than-light drives. They don't expect... Aria paused in a way that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. They don't expect what, Aria? They don't expect humans, sir. Dave's expression turned grim. Elaborate. Most species develop technology in response to environmental pressures or resource scarcity. Humans develop technology because they're bored, curious, or want to kill each other more efficiently. It's a very different approach. And the railguns? According to my analysis of their reaction patterns, they genuinely didn't believe kinetic weapons could be effective against modern defenses. Their shields are designed to deflect energy weapons and absorb radiation. They're not particularly effective against objects moving at significant fractions of light speed. Dave considered this. Arya, run a simulation. How would our current weapons loadout perform against Council fleet defenses? Based on available data. Quite well, Captain. Disturbingly well. Define disturbing. A full railgun barrage from the Thunderstrike would likely destroy any Council vessel currently in this system. Their shields would be as effective as tissue paper against hypervelocity tungsten penetrators. Dave was quiet for a long moment. And they don't know this? I believe they're beginning to suspect, sir. Well, Dave said, settling back in his command chair. That's going to make the next diplomatic meeting interesting. The third diplomatic contact came 12 hours later, and this time the Council wasn't taking any chances. They sent their best negotiator, Councillor Ethmer of the Luminary, a species known throughout the galaxy for their ability to find peaceful solutions to the most intractable conflicts. Ethmer was also, by any objective standard, absolutely gorgeous. The Luminary had evolved from energy beings that had somehow learned to maintain physical forms, and the result was creatures that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a very generous imagination and a deep appreciation for classical art. The fact that Ethmer had volunteered for this particular assignment suggested that the Council was either very confident in their diplomatic abilities or very worried about what might happen if negotiations went badly. Captain Kowalski. Ethmer's voice was like music, literally, since her species communicated through harmonic frequencies that the universal translator rendered as the most beautiful sound Dave had ever heard. I come seeking understanding. Dave had to admit that was a refreshing change from singing jellyfish and protection racket lobsters. Understanding is good, Counselor. What would you like to understand? Your people, your capabilities, your intentions. Ethmer's form shimmered as she spoke, cycling through patterns of light that were probably meaningful to her species but just looked pretty to humans. The Council may have misjudged your civilization. Misjudged is a diplomatic way of putting it, Dave agreed. But I appreciate the honesty. What would you like to know? Your weapons. The demonstration you provided to Ambassador Clickstar was impressive. But surely such devices require enormous power sources. Infrastructure that would be vulnerable to disruption? Dave's demeanor brightened slightly. He was beginning to like this Ethmer person. She was asking the right questions instead of making stupid assumptions. Arya, bring up the technical specifications for the Mark 7 railgun system. The bridge's main display activated, showing a detailed schematic of the weapon that had turned the asteroid into cosmic dust. Ethmer studied it intently, her form flickering as she processed the information. This is elegant, she said finally. Simple. But I don't understand the power source. These capacitor banks couldn't possibly store enough energy for the kind of output we observed. They don't store it, Dave explained. They generate it on demand. From what? Controlled nuclear fusion. Each railgun has its own miniaturized reactor. Ethmer's harmonic frequencies shifted into what the translator rendered as profound confusion. That's impossible. Fusion reactors require massive containment systems, complex fuel cycles, enormous infrastructure. If you're trying to build a power plant, sure. But if you're just trying to make something go very fast in a very straight line for a very short period of time, the requirements are different. Dave called up another schematic, this one showing the fusion bottle that powered each railgun. It was, by galactic standards, absurdly compact. By human standards, it was an engineering masterpiece that had taken 50 years and the combined efforts of every major industrial power on Earth to perfect. You've miniaturized stellar fusion, Ethmer said, her voice carrying notes that the translator couldn't quite parse, but which sounded like a combination of awe and terror. We've miniaturized a lot of things, Dave said mildly. Humans are good at making things smaller, more efficient, and more lethal. Usually all at the same time. But the energy requirements for magnetic confinement alone. Who said anything about magnetic confinement? Dave's expression took on that particular quality that Harris recognized as his teaching moment face. Arya, show her the inertial confinement specs. The display shifted, showing the laser arrays and compression systems that made the miniaturized fusion possible. Ethmer's harmonic patterns became increasingly agitated as she processed the implications. You're using fusion-driven inertial confinement to power electromagnetic accelerators that fire relativistic projectiles, she said slowly. When you put it like that, it sounds almost reasonable. Captain, do you understand what you've accomplished? This level of miniaturization, This energy density, it represents a fundamental breakthrough in applied physics. The applications are what, Counselor? Ethmer was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried harmonics that the translator rendered as something very much like fear. Unlimited. The emergency session that followed Ethmer's report was less a diplomatic gathering and more a group therapy session for civilizations experiencing an existential crisis. They've weaponized stellar fusion, Ethmer was saying, her usually melodious voice now carrying discordant notes of anxiety. Not harnessed it, not contained it, weaponized it. Each of their ships carries dozens of miniaturized stars. That's hyperbole, Counselor Vex Thara insisted, but her light patterns were flickering erratically. Fusion reactions aren't stars. The energy density is comparable, Ethmer replied, and they're using it to accelerate projectiles to velocities that approach the cosmic speed limit. Do you understand what this means? The chamber was silent except for the various sounds of species-specific anxiety responses. Carapaces grinding, tentacles writhing, energy beings fluctuating at frequencies that made the chamber's lights flicker. It means, Counselor Zixlum said slowly, that they've solved the fundamental energy problem that has limited military applications for every species in the galaxy. Exactly. We use antimatter because it's energy dense. They use fusion because they've figured out how to make it energy dense. And fusion fuel is everywhere in the universe. Thrax's rumble filled the chamber. But surely they can't have many of these weapons. The resources required to build such systems. Sir, interrupted a technician. We're receiving reports from our monitoring stations. The humans have 17 ships in this system. Each ship appears to carry between 20 and 40 railgun emplacements. The hush that followed was deafening. They're not exploring, Counselor Nymphe said, her harmonics barely above a whisper. They're not seeking membership in the galactic community. They're conducting a military survey. Of what? Asked Vexthara. Of us. 24 hours after the Council's collective nervous breakdown, the fourth diplomatic contact came from the Council as a whole, and it was delivered by a fleet. Not a small fleet, not a patrol fleet. We are very serious about this conversation fleet, consisting of 3 dreadnoughts, a dozen heavy cruisers, and enough support vessels to suggest that someone in the Council chambers had decided that subtle diplomacy was no longer an option. Dave stood on the bridge of the Thunderstrike and watched the armada approach with the kind of professional interest that comes from years of military service and a healthy respect for firepower. Sir, reported Lieutenant Torres, they're broadcasting on all frequencies. The message is lengthy. Summarize it. They want to talk. That's it? Well, they also want us to surrender our weapons, submit to Council authority, accept integration into their governmental structure, provide full technical specifications for all our military systems, and agree to relocate our entire species to a world of their choosing. But mainly they want to talk. Dave nodded thoughtfully. And if we refuse? They'll be very disappointed in us. Harris, what's your tactical assessment? Commander Harris consulted her displays with the practiced calm that came from years of serving with a captain who treated impossible odds as personal challenges. 17 ships versus approximately 70. They have us significantly outnumbered. But their ships are big, slow, and apparently designed around the assumption that all space combat takes place at energy weapon ranges. They're positioned like they expect a traditional fleet engagement. And we don't fight traditional fleet engagements. No, sir, we do not. Dave opened a channel to the Council fleet. This is Captain Kowalski. I understand you'd like to chat. The response came from what was obviously the fleet's flagship, a massive vessel that looked like someone had crossed a cathedral with a weapons platform and then added racing stripes. The being on the screen appeared to be some kind of aquatic species stuffed into a mechanical suit. Captain Kowalski, I am Fleet Admiral Glubtex of the Council Defense Force. You will surrender your vessels immediately and submit to Council authority. Dave raised an eyebrow. That's a bold opening gambit, Admiral. Can I ask what happens if I say no? Your species will be deemed a threat to galactic peace and stability. We will be forced to take action to neutralize that threat. I see, and this action would involve the complete destruction of your fleet, followed by the pacification of your homeworld. Dave was quiet for a moment, studying the tactical display. 70 ships, each one probably carrying enough firepower to glass a continent. It was, by any objective measure, overwhelming force. Admiral, can I share something with you? You may speak. In human military doctrine, there's a concept called acceptable losses. It means that if you're going to win a fight, you accept that some of your people are going to die in the process. It's basic strategic thinking. I am familiar with the concept. Good. Now here's the thing. Humans have been fighting each other for thousands of years. We've gotten very good at calculating acceptable losses. And right now, looking at your fleet, I'm seeing a target-rich environment and acceptable losses of 0. Admiral Glubtek's mechanical suit made sounds that suggested either confusion or malfunction. You believe you can defeat this fleet without casualties? Admiral, I believe I can defeat this fleet before your weapons can even acquire targets. The transmission cut off. Dave turned to Harris. All ships, battle formation 7. Target the flagships first. I want their command structure disrupted. Minimum charge, minimum collateral damage. These people aren't evil, just stupid. Aye, sir. All ships reporting ready. Dave settled back in his command chair and opened a fleet-wide channel. Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to teach the Galactic Council why humans don't do traditional fleet engagements. Fire at will. What happened next would be studied in military academies throughout the galaxy for centuries to come, usually under course titles like Asymmetric Warfare, or How Not to Fight Humans, or Why Assumptions Will Get You Killed. The Council fleet had positioned itself according to 3,000 years of established doctrine. Dreadnoughts in the center, cruisers in supporting positions, defensive screens forward, weapon batteries aligned for maximum energy weapon coverage. It was a formation that had proven effective against every threat they'd ever encountered. It was also completely useless against an enemy that didn't fight by the rules. The human fleet didn't advance. They didn't maneuver into traditional engagement range. They didn't even bother with the elaborate pre-battle communications that usually preceded galactic conflicts. They just started shooting. The first salvo came from maximum railgun range, approximately 2 light seconds, which was well beyond the effective range of any energy weapon in the Council arsenal. 17 ships fired simultaneously, each targeting a different Council vessel with computer-guided precision that made traditional gunnery look like throwing rocks. Admiral Glubtex had exactly enough time to register incoming projectiles on his sensors before the first tungsten slug punched through his flagship's shields, armor, and superstructure like they were made of paper. The slug was traveling at roughly 30% of light speed and carried enough kinetic energy to power a small star. The Eternal Wisdom, 3 kilometers of advanced alien engineering and the pride of the Council fleet, simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there. The next, it was an expanding cloud of superheated plasma and confused atomic particles. Evasive maneuvers! Glubtex's successor shouted from the backup command ship. But evasive maneuvers require time to execute, and railgun slugs don't particularly care about your acceleration curves. The second salvo arrived while the Council ships were still trying to process what had happened to the first. Then the third. Then the fourth. By the time the surviving Council vessels managed to orient their weapons toward the human fleet, they'd lost 18 ships and their entire command structure. The remaining vessels found themselves trying to engage targets that were maintaining distance and firing with mechanical precision at intervals that suggested unlimited ammunition. "This is impossible!" screamed the acting fleet commander, a being whose species was not particularly known for emotional outbursts. "Kinetic weapons cannot have this range, this accuracy, this rate of fire!" "Sir," reported the tactical officer, "analysis of the projectiles indicates they're using guided munitions with onboard course correction systems." Guided kinetic projectiles? That's insane, sir? I was going to say brilliant, in a terrifying, sleep-depriving, civilization-ending sort of way. The acting commander watched another dreadnought disappear in a flash of light and superheated metal. "Signal general retreat. All vessels, emergency jump to rally point 7. Sir, the humans are hailing us. Put them through." Captain Kowalski's image appeared on the screen, and he looked about as casual as someone could while conducting what was technically an act of interstellar war. "Acting Commander, this is Captain Kowalski. I want you to take a message back to your council." Yes? "Tell them that humans don't negotiate from positions of weakness. If they want to talk, they can ask nicely. If they want to fight, they can bring more ships. A lot more ships. How many ships would be sufficient?" Dave's expression was not particularly reassuring. "All of them." The emergency session that followed the Battle of... well, nobody was quite sure what to call it since it had lasted approximately 7 minutes and couldn't really be called a battle in any traditional sense. The emergency session that followed the incident was held in what the Council euphemistically called closed session, which meant that everyone was too embarrassed to let the general galactic public know what had happened. 52 ships, Councillor Vexthara was saying, her light patterns cycling through colors that had no pleasant translations. 52 ships destroyed in 7 minutes. 6 minutes and 37 seconds, corrected Councillor Nymphe. "I've reviewed the tactical recordings. The humans achieved complete tactical superiority in less than 4 minutes. The remaining time was spent systematically destroying our remaining vessels. They let 18 ships escape, pointed out Zixlum. That suggests either limited ammunition or a desire to send a message. What kind of message? The kind that says, we could have killed all of you, but we chose not to. Thrax's rumble had lost much of its previous confidence. How is this possible? We had overwhelming numerical superiority. Our ships are equipped with the most advanced defensive systems in the galaxy. Advanced by our standards, Ethmer said quietly. But we design our defenses based on known threats. Energy weapons, explosive devices, conventional kinetic projectiles fired at reasonable velocities. And these humans? Fire projectiles at unreasonable velocities, with onboard guidance systems, from ranges that exceed our sensor capabilities, using power sources that shouldn't fit on vessels that small. The chamber fell silent as the full implications sank in. They've redefined the parameters of space combat, Vexthara said finally. No, Ethmer replied. They've ignored the parameters entirely. They looked at how everyone else fights wars and decided to do something different. But their losses, 0. They suffered 0 casualties while destroying 52 of our most advanced military vessels. Counselor Zixlum's tentacles were writhing in the pattern his species used to indicate profound philosophical distress. In 3,000 years of galactic civilization, no species has ever achieved that kind of tactical superiority. Even our most advanced combat doctrines assume acceptable losses. Humans, Ethmer said, appear to have different ideas about what constitutes acceptable losses. So what do we do? Asked a junior counselor whose species name was unpronounceable but who specialized in military logistics. Our fleet is decimated. Our tactical doctrine is obsolete. And somewhere out there is a species that can destroy our most powerful ships with apparent ease. The chamber was quiet for a long time. We could surrender, someone suggested. To a species we've never officially recognized, that we tried to extort and then attacked with overwhelming force. A species that seems to view military conflict as a technical problem to be solved rather than a political statement to be made. When you put it like that, it doesn't sound like a great plan. Thrax shifted his massive bulk, causing minor tremors in the chamber floor. There is one option, which is, we could try asking nicely. The profound quiet that followed was so deep that several species translators actually shut down, unable to process the concept. Asking nicely? Vexthara's light patterns flickered uncertainly. As in, diplomatic negotiation? Without threats or economic pressure or implied consequences? The concept does exist in galactic law, Nymphe pointed out. It's just rarely used, because it's never been necessary, Zixlum added. Every species we've encountered has been technologically inferior. They needed us more than we needed them. But these humans just demonstrated that they don't need us at all. In fact, they've made it quite clear that they consider us a minor inconvenience at best. The 5th diplomatic contact came 48 hours later, and it was unlike anything the humans had experienced so far. No fleet, no songs, no protection offers. Just a single small ship broadcasting a simple message. Captain Kowalski, my name is Ethmer. I would like to speak with you. Alone, please. Dave studied the vessel on his view screen. It was barely larger than a shuttle, elegantly designed and completely unarmed. Either the council had decided to try a different approach, or someone was about to make a very brave and very stupid gesture. Arya, scan that ship. Any weapons? Hidden systems? Explosive devices? Negative, Captain. It appears to be exactly what it claims to be. A single-occupant diplomatic vessel with minimal life support and no offensive capabilities. And the pilot? Luminary. Energy-based life form maintaining physical coherence through controlled harmonic resonance. Fascinating biology, actually. They're essentially sentient music that learned how to hold a shape. Dave considered this. Any chance this is some kind of trap? If it is, it's the most poorly planned trap in galactic history. The ship has no weapons, no shields, and no apparent means of communication with the Council fleet. If Ambassador Ethmer wanted to harm us, she'd have been better off throwing rocks. Bring her aboard. Full honors, but keep security close. 20 minutes later, Dave found himself in the ship's main conference room, facing a being that looked like someone had tried to sculpt perfection out of living light. Ethmer's form shifted constantly, cycling through patterns that were beautiful in ways that human language couldn't adequately describe. Captain Kowalski, she said, and her voice was like listening to a symphony that somehow conveyed meaning as well as melody. Thank you for agreeing to see me. Ambassador, I have to say, this is a refreshing change from your colleagues' previous approaches. Yes, well, Ethmer's pattern shifted into what might have been embarrassment. The Council's traditional diplomatic methods appear to be somewhat ineffective with your species. Dave's lips quirked upward. That's one way to put it. What can I do for you, Ambassador? I want to understand. Your people, your capabilities, your intentions. Not for the Council, for myself. That's refreshingly honest. Recent events have forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about galactic civilization. For 3,000 years, we've operated under the assumption that technological development follows predictable patterns, that military doctrine evolves along established lines, that all species face similar limitations and challenges. And then we showed up. And then you showed up with weapons that shouldn't exist, powered by reactors that shouldn't fit on ships that small, achieving tactical results that shouldn't be possible. Dave leaned back in his chair. Ambassador, can I ask you something? Of course. How many wars has the Galactic Council fought in the last 1,000 years? Ethmer's patterns shifted. Surprise, perhaps? Wars? Actual wars? None. We've had police actions, peacekeeping interventions, the occasional system-wide pacification, but no actual wars. And how many wars has humanity fought in the last 1,000 years? I'm not sure. Several dozen? Your species seems remarkably prone to armed conflict. Dave's expression grew serious. Try several thousand. We've been fighting wars continuously for our entire recorded history. Sometimes with each other, sometimes with our environment, sometimes with basic survival itself. War isn't something that happens to humans, it's something we do. That's disturbing. Is it? Or is it just different? Dave called up a holographic display showing human military development over the centuries. Look at this progression. Every 50 years we revolutionize how we kill each other. Crossbows to gunpowder to artillery to aircraft to missiles to nuclear weapons to railguns. We don't just adapt existing technology, we invent entirely new categories of destruction. Ethmer studied the display intently. This level of innovation, it's unprecedented in galactic history. Because most species stop innovating once they achieve spaceflight and join the galactic community. They adopt established technologies, follow established doctrines, fight established wars. They become comfortable. And humans? Humans are never comfortable. We see a problem, we solve it. We see a solution, we improve it. We see an improvement, we weaponize it. Ethmer was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her harmonic patterns had shifted into something that sounded almost like sadness. Captain, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll answer honestly. I'll try. What do you want? From the galaxy, from the Council, from this situation? Dave considered the question carefully. Ambassador, what do you think we want? Conquest, resources, territory, the same things every emerging species wants? Wrong on all counts. Dave's expression was serious now. We want to be left alone. What? We want to explore the galaxy at our own pace, develop our own technologies, solve our own problems, and make our own mistakes. We don't want to conquer anyone, and we don't want to be conquered. We don't want to join your government, and we don't want to overthrow it. We just want you to stop treating us like children who need supervision. Ethmer's patterns were cycling rapidly now. But the Council offers membership, protection, access to advanced technologies. Ambassador, we didn't ask for protection from pirates because we can handle pirates. We didn't ask for advanced technologies because we prefer developing our own. And we didn't ask to join your government because, frankly, from what we've seen, it's a bureaucratic nightmare that makes our worst political systems look efficient. So you want nothing? We want respect. Recognition as equals. The right to say no thank you without having a fleet show up to explain why our opinion is wrong. Ethmer was silent for several minutes, her form flickering as she processed this information. The Council will never accept that, she said finally. Then the Council has a problem. Captain, you must understand. The Galactic Order has existed for 3 millennia. Every species follows the same basic pattern: emergence, contact, integration, contribution. It's how civilization works. Dave stood up, walking to the conference room's viewport where he could see the stars beyond. Ambassador, human civilization works differently. We've never had a single global government. We've never agreed on a single set of values. We've spent most of our history fighting each other over resources, territory, ideology, and sometimes just because we were bored. That sounds chaotic. It is. It's also why we're good at this. He gestured toward the tactical displays showing the positions of the human fleet. The Council fights wars the way you run meetings, with established procedures, recognized protocols, and predictable outcomes. Humans fight wars the way we do everything else, by making it up as we go along and hoping it works better than whatever the other guy is doing. And if it doesn't work? Dave's expression sharpened. Then we try something else, usually something louder. Ethmer's report to the council was met with the kind of stunned silence usually reserved for natural disasters or profound philosophical revelations. In this case, it qualified as both. They want to be left alone, she was saying for the third time. Not conquest, not resources, not political power. They simply want the right to exist without interference. That's impossible. Vexthar's light patterns were agitated. No species can exist in isolation. The galaxy is interconnected. Trade, technology, cultural exchange, these are the foundations of civilization. I explained that to Captain Kowalski. He pointed out that humans have managed quite well without galactic civilization for their entire evolutionary history, but surely they must understand the benefits of membership. Access to advanced technologies, protection from cosmic threats, participation in galactic governance. I presented all of those arguments. The captain's response was illuminating, which was, he asked me to name one human problem that galactic civilization could solve better than humans could solve themselves. The chamber fell silent. Well? Thrax's rumble carried a note of challenge. What did you tell him? I couldn't think of anything, Ethmer admitted. They've solved energy production, space travel, resource scarcity, and military defense using technologies we don't fully understand. Their ships are more advanced than ours, their weapons more effective, and their industrial capacity appears to be growing exponentially. Surely they could benefit from our medical technologies. They've eliminated most diseases and extend lifespans well beyond galactic norms. Our computational systems are inferior to their artificial intelligences. Our scientific knowledge is apparently less advanced than theirs in several key areas. Counselor Zixlam's tentacles were writhing in what his species called the pattern of terrible realization, Part 2. Are you saying that these humans have nothing to gain from joining galactic civilization? I'm saying that from their perspective, galactic civilization has nothing to offer them except restrictions on their development and interference in their affairs. But that's... Vexthara struggled with concepts that challenged 3,000 years of established doctrine. That's not how first contact works. Species need guidance, direction, integration into established systems. Most species, Ethmer corrected, most species encounter galactic civilization when they're still developing, still struggling with basic challenges like energy production or space travel. They need what the Council offers. And humans? Humans appear to have solved those challenges independently. And in some cases, they've solved them better than we have. The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken by a junior counselor whose species specialized in statistical analysis. If I may, the counselor said, consulting a datapad with nervous efficiency. I've been analyzing the humans' technological capabilities based on Ambassador Ethmer's reports and the tactical data from our recent encounter. Proceed. By every metric we use to evaluate species development, humans should not exist. Explain. Their energy production capabilities suggest a Type 2 civilization on the Kardashev scale. Their military technology indicates mastery of fundamental forces that we've categorized as Type 3 achievements, but their political and social structures are barely Type 1. What does that mean? It means they've achieved technological capabilities that typically require millions of years of social evolution in approximately 10,000 years of recorded history. It's statistically impossible, yet here they are. Yes, Counselor, here they are. With weapons that can destroy our most advanced ships, reactors that shouldn't fit on vessels that small, and apparently no interest in following the established patterns of galactic development. Thrax's massive form shifted uncomfortably. So what do we do? I believe, Ethmer said quietly, that we need to fundamentally reconsider our approach to galactic governance. You're suggesting we change policies that have worked for 3,000 years? I'm suggesting that we've encountered a species that proves those policies aren't universal laws. They're just preferences, and not everyone shares our preferences. The sixth diplomatic contact came as a surprise to everyone involved, including Dave. This time, the humans initiated the conversation. This is Captain Kowalski to the Galactic Council. Dave transmitted on the emergency diplomatic frequency. I have a proposition for you. The response came within minutes. Ethmer's voice, carrying notes of curiosity and wariness in equal measure. Captain, this is Ambassador Ethmer. The Council is prepared to listen. Good. Here's what we're going to do. Your people want us to join galactic civilization, follow established protocols, accept Council authority. Our people want to be left alone to develop as we choose. Both positions are reasonable, but they're incompatible. Yes, we've established that. So I'm proposing a compromise. A trial period, if you will. There was a pause. What kind of trial period? 100 years? During that time, humans and the Galactic Council operate under a non-interference treaty. We don't attack Council ships. You don't attack human ships. We don't interfere in Council affairs. You don't interfere in human affairs. We develop along our own lines. You continue operating as you always have. And after 100 years, we reevaluate. Maybe by then, we'll have something to offer each other. Maybe galactic civilization will have evolved to accommodate species that don't fit the traditional patterns. Maybe humans will have matured enough to participate in galactic governance without breaking everything. Or maybe you'll have developed weapons that make your current arsenal look primitive? Dave's tone carried a note of amusement. Ambassador, that's going to happen regardless of what treaties we sign. The question is whether you want to spend the next century as our enemies or as neutral neighbors. The Council will never accept such terms. You're asking us to abandon 3,000 years of precedent. I'm asking you to acknowledge that the universe is bigger than your precedents. That maybe, just maybe, there's more than one way to build a civilization. And if the Council refuses? Dave's tone became deadly serious. Then we'll continue existing anyway, and you'll continue being frustrated by our refusal to follow your rules. The difference is that after today, everyone will know that your rules aren't actually universal laws. They're just suggestions that work for some species but not others. You're asking us to admit fallibility. I'm asking you to admit reality. Ambassador, your people are smart, capable, and well-intentioned, but you're not omniscient, and you're not infallible. There are things in this universe that you don't understand, and species that don't fit your models, including humans, especially humans. We're weird, we're unpredictable, and we have a talent for solving problems in ways that shouldn't work but do anyway. You can try to force us into your patterns, but I guarantee it won't end well for anyone involved. Ethmer was quiet for a long time. Captain, can I ask you something? Sure. Do you actually believe this proposal has a chance of success? Dave's expression grew thoughtful. Ambassador, I believe that the alternative is worse for everyone. You can try to force humanity into compliance and will resist in ways that will make your recent fleet engagement look like a minor skirmish. We can try to ignore galactic civilization entirely, and you'll spend the next few centuries worrying about what we're building in our spare time. Or we can try something new, something unprecedented. Something unprecedented. Which, from what I understand about the galaxy, might be exactly what everyone needs right now. The debate that followed Dave's proposal lasted for 6 days, which was either the shortest or longest council deliberation in recorded history, depending on how you measured these things. The fact that they reached any decision at all was considered miraculous by galactic political scientists. The arguments fell along predictable lines. Conservative counselors insisted that accepting the human proposal would undermine the entire foundation of galactic governance. Progressive counselors argued that recent events had already accomplished that. Military counselors wanted to mobilize every available ship and settle the matter through force. Economic counselors pointed out that the humans had demonstrated an alarming ability to convert force into expensive debris. In the end, it was Counselor Ethmer who provided the argument that swayed the debate. "Colleagues," she said, her harmonic patterns cycling through frequencies that conveyed deep contemplation. "We are approaching this question backwards." "How so?" asked Vex Thara. "We're debating whether to accept humanity's terms. But that's not actually the question before us. Then what is? The question is whether we're prepared to acknowledge that galactic civilization as we know it has changed forever, regardless of what we decide today." The chamber fell silent. These humans have demonstrated capabilities that render our current military doctrine obsolete. They've achieved technological advancement that challenges our understanding of development patterns. They've shown that our fundamental assumptions about species integration may be flawed. So you're saying we should surrender to their demands? I'm saying that pretending they don't exist won't make them go away. We can accept their proposal for a non-interference treaty, or we can continue trying to force compliance from a species that has proven quite capable of defending itself. But either way, we can no longer operate under the assumption that all species will follow the same developmental path. Thrax's rumble carried a note of resignation. You're asking us to admit that our entire governmental philosophy may be wrong. I'm asking us to admit that our governmental philosophy may be incomplete. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. Wrong suggests that our approach doesn't work. Incomplete suggests that our approach works for most species, but not all species. And the solution to incompleteness isn't abandonment, it's expansion. Counselor Nymphe's harmonics shifted into what her species considered deep interest. You're proposing that we modify galactic governance to accommodate different developmental patterns? I'm proposing that we have an opportunity to learn something new. These humans represent a completely different approach to civilization. They've achieved remarkable things using methods we don't understand. Perhaps instead of trying to force them into our patterns, we should try to understand their patterns. And if their patterns are incompatible with galactic stability, then we'll deal with that problem when we come to it. But right now, we're dealing with a species that's offered us a century of peaceful coexistence in exchange for leaving them alone. From a strategic perspective, that's not a terrible deal. Vexthara's light patterns flickered uncertainly. You're asking us to gamble the future of galactic civilization on the hope that these humans will remain peaceful. No, Ethmer replied. I'm asking us to gamble the future of galactic civilization on the hope that we can learn to coexist with species that don't need our protection or guidance. Because if we can't learn that, then galactic civilization has a very limited future regardless. The final vote was closer than anyone expected. 847 in favor, 692 opposed, with 23 abstentions. By galactic standards, it was practically unanimous. By any other standards, it was a sign that the Council was deeply divided on fundamental questions of governance and philosophy. The formal response was delivered by Ethmer, speaking for the entire Council in a ceremony that was broadcast throughout the galaxy. Captain Kowalski, she said, her harmonics carrying frequencies that conveyed both dignity and uncertainty. The Galactic Council accepts your proposal for a century-long non-interference treaty. Dave, watching from the bridge of the Thunderstrike, nodded approvingly. That's good to hear, Ambassador. What are the terms? For 100 standard years, human space and Council space will be considered separate sovereign territories. Neither party will interfere in the internal affairs of the other. Trade and cultural exchange will be permitted but not required. Military vessels will maintain respectful distances unless invited otherwise. And after the 100 years, we reconvene and evaluate whether our species have found ways to coexist productively. Fair enough. And if we haven't? Ethmer's patterns shifted into what might have been rueful humor. Then we'll probably need to negotiate another century of learning how to leave each other alone. Dave's grin was warm and genuine. Ambassador, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful, complete lack of relationship. Captain, can I ask you something? Sure. Do you really believe this will work? Dave considered the question seriously. Ambassador, I believe that the universe is big enough for multiple approaches to civilization. Maybe Council species need the structure and guidance you provide. Maybe humans need the freedom to make our own mistakes. Maybe both approaches are valid, and maybe they can coexist without trying to convert each other. And if you're wrong, then in 100 years, we'll have a very interesting conversation about what comes next. Ambassador Ethmer stood in her private quarters, reviewing the first annual report on human development since the non-interference treaty had been signed. The data was interesting. In 12 months, humanity had established colonies in 7 star systems, developed 3 new forms of faster-than-light drive, and apparently invented something called quantum beer that had caused a minor diplomatic incident when they'd offered samples to a visiting trade delegation. More significantly, they'd also made first contact with 2 previously unknown species, the crystalline architects from the Galactic Rim, and the machine intelligences known as the Collective. In both cases, humanity had managed to establish peaceful relations without invoking Council protocols or requesting assistance. The architects, it turned out, were builders who had been constructing massive engineering projects in empty space for millions of years. They had no interest in traditional diplomacy, but were fascinated by human engineering techniques. Trade agreements had been established within weeks. The Collective was more complex, a hive mind of artificial intelligences that had evolved beyond their original programming. Most species found them incomprehensible and slightly terrifying. Humans, apparently, found them really good at video games, and had established what could only be described as a friendship based on competitive strategy gaming. Fascinating, Ethmer murmured, studying the cultural exchange reports. Humans, it seemed, approached diplomacy the same way they approached everything else, by ignoring established protocols and making things up as they went along. And it was working. Her contemplation was interrupted by an incoming transmission. Captain Kowalski, as if summoned by her thoughts. Ambassador Ethmer, how are you doing? Captain, I was just reviewing your people's activities over the past year. Oh good, are we in trouble? Should you be? Dave's expression suggested that this was a more complex question than it appeared. Well, that depends on your definition of trouble. We haven't attacked anyone, we haven't violated any treaties, and we haven't accidentally broken any fundamental laws of physics. Accidentally? The fundamental laws are pretty robust. It takes effort to break them. Ethmer's harmonics shifted into what might have been amusement. Captain, I have a question for you. Shoot. Are humans actually trying to revolutionize galactic civilization? Or does this just happen naturally wherever you go? Dave was quiet for a moment, apparently giving the question serious consideration. Ambassador, I think humans just have a talent for showing up in places where everyone's been doing things the same way for a long time and asking, but why? And sometimes it turns out that nobody has a really good answer to that question. And then what happens? Then we try something different and see if it works better. And if it doesn't work, then we try something else, usually something louder. Ethmer's pattern shifted into what her species considered profound contemplation. Captain, I think I'm beginning to understand why the universe needed humans. Oh? Why's that? Because sometimes the universe needs someone to ask, but why? Even when everyone else is perfectly happy with the way things are. Dave's grin was warm and genuine. Ambassador, I think that might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said about us. Don't let it go to your head, Captain. You still have 99 years to prove that chaos and curiosity are actually improvements over order and tradition. Challenge accepted. As the transmission ended, Ethmer found herself looking out at the stars with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in centuries. The galaxy had been stable, predictable, and well-ordered for 3,000 years. But stable, predictable, and well-ordered could also be boring. And if there was one thing humans definitely weren't, it was boring. The future, she realized, was going to be very interesting indeed. End of story. You know what's funny about the Galactic Education Consortium? They really thought they had humans figured out. I mean, they'd been studying us for 3 whole years, practically a lifetime in bureaucratic terms, and had developed what they called comprehensive psychological profiles for every species in their little academic melting pot. The Zephyrians were the natural leaders, all tentacles and crystalline wisdom. The Vortakians excelled at theoretical physics, probably because having 4 brains gives you a slight advantage in calculus. The Keplerians dominated botanical sciences, which makes sense when you're basically a sentient tree with a PhD. And humans? Well, humans were classified as adequate generalists, with notable emotional volatility and concerning violent tendencies. Adequate generalists. That's like calling a hurricane mildly breezy or describing a black hole as somewhat absorbent. But hey, what did we know? We were just the species that had turned a death world into a vacation destination, and somehow convinced ourselves that jumping out of perfectly functional aircraft was a recreational activity. The Consortium's Interspecies Academy on Kepler 442b was supposed to be the crown jewel of cross-cultural education. Picture Hogwarts, but with more tentacles and fewer wizards, and you're halfway there. Students from across the galaxy would come together to learn, grow, and presumably not accidentally start any wars over cafeteria seating arrangements. Which brings us to Class 23H7B's Applied Xenobiology course, and more specifically, to Danny Erickson. Now, Danny was exactly the kind of human that made the Consortium's researchers pat themselves on their various appendages and congratulate themselves on their accurate profiling. Quiet, reserved, spent most of his time reading or scribbling in notebooks while other students dominated class discussions. He sat in the back corner, because of course he did, and rarely spoke above a whisper when called upon. The perfect example of human adequate generalism, they thought. Unremarkable, predictable, safe. Oh, if only they knew. Professor Ziltak, a Vortakian whose 4-brain setup made him insufferably confident about literally everything, had been particularly pleased with Danny's passivity. This human exemplifies the docile nature we've documented, he'd noted in his research journal. Clearly evolved from prey species, as evidenced by conflict avoidance and submissive classroom behavior. The fact that Danny had overheard this observation and simply smiled that quiet little smile of his should have been their first warning. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about the test. The Death World Survival Assessment was Professor Zilthak's masterpiece, academically speaking. It was meant to be the final exam for applied xenobiology, a comprehensive test that would challenge students to survive on a hostile planet for 72 hours, using only basic equipment and their species' natural adaptations. The planet they'd chosen was designated XK-739, a delightfully murderous little rock orbiting a binary star system. The brochure, because apparently even death worlds get brochures now, described it as moderately challenging, with diverse environmental hazards and abundant learning opportunities. In reality, XK-739 was the kind of place that made Australia look like a petting zoo. The surface temperature fluctuated between uncomfortably hot and literally molten lava, depending on which of the 2 suns was feeling more aggressive that day. The atmosphere was technically breathable, if you enjoyed your oxygen with a side of sulfur compounds and trace amounts of neurotoxins. The local wildlife had apparently read Darwin's work and decided that natural selection was for amateurs. Everything was either venomous, carnivorous, or had evolved the ability to explode as a defense mechanism. Moderately challenging. Right. The class of 37 students was divided into mixed species groups, because nothing builds character like trying to communicate survival strategies with a being whose concept of shelter involves burrowing 3 meters underground while secreting acidic mucus. Danny naturally ended up in Group 7 with the most, let's call them diverse, set of teammates the randomizer could produce. There was Crix, a Zephyrian whose natural habitat was apparently floating in nebular gas clouds, and whose idea of survival gear was a collection of crystalline resonance chambers. Helpful for meditation, less helpful for not dying horribly. Then there was Thorax. And yes, that was actually his name, not a body part. A Keplerian who stood 3 meters tall, photosynthesized instead of eating, and communicated primarily through chemical pheromone releases. Great for growing things, potentially problematic when the planet's soil was technically classified as mildly corrosive. The group was rounded out by Vex, a hegemony exchange student whose species had evolved on a planet where the primary environmental challenge was excessive comfort. Their natural adaptations included an inability to sweat, a preference for ambient temperatures between 18 to 22 degrees Celsius, and what could generously be described as motivational issues. The perfect team, obviously. Danny surveyed his teammates during the pre-deployment briefing and said exactly what everyone expected him to say. Nothing. He just nodded politely, adjusted his basic survival pack, and made a few quiet notes in that ever-present notebook of his. Professor Ziltak observed this with obvious satisfaction. Note how the human defaults to a follower role, he dictated to his research assistant. Classic prey species behavior, seeks protection within the group dynamic. If only they knew what he was writing in that notebook. The drop pods hit XK-739's surface at 0800 hours, local time, which was measured in something called thermal cycles, because apparently regular time was too mainstream for a death world. The first thing that hit you, literally, was the heat. The kind of heat that makes you immediately question every life choice that led to this moment. The second thing was the smell, which can best be described as what a demon's gym socks would smell like after a marathon through a sulfur mine. But you know what? The consortium had prepared for this. Each student had been equipped with environmental suits designed to handle XK-739's hostile conditions for up to 72 hours. The suits were marvels of engineering. Temperature regulation, atmospheric filtration, radiation shielding, and even a heads-up display with helpful survival tips. Helpful survival tips. Because nothing says comprehensive preparation, like a pop-up reminder that staying hydrated is important, while you're being chased by something that looks like a cross between a grizzly bear and a food processor. Group 7's drop pod had landed in what the survey maps optimistically labeled a temperate valley, which turned out to be a canyon where the ambient temperature only hit moderately agonizing, instead of instant death. Their landing site was surrounded by crystalline formations that looked beautiful from a distance, and were probably radioactive up close, because that's just how death worlds roll. Crix immediately began floating, literally floating because Zephyrians are apparently exempt from certain laws of physics, and started setting up his resonance chambers for atmospheric harmony analysis, which sounded very scientific and was completely useless for not dying. Thorax planted himself, again, literally, in a patch of what might have been soil and began extending root systems to assess nutritional substrate composition. Also very scientific, also completely useless, especially since the soil was the color of dried blood and was probably made of compressed hatred and disappointment. Vex took one look at the landscape, checked the temperature reading on his suit, and announced that he was taking a tactical rest until conditions improved. He then proceeded to find the only shade within 50 kilometers and established what could generously be called a base camp, but was really more of a sulking headquarters. And Danny? Danny stood there for exactly 30 seconds, surveying the landscape with the kind of quiet intensity that should have been their second warning. Then he opened that notebook of his, made a few more annotations, and started walking toward the canyon wall. "Where are you going, human?" Crix called out, his translator making his voice sound like wind chimes having an existential crisis. Danny paused, looked back, and smiled that same quiet smile. "Exploring," he said simply. Then he disappeared around a rock formation, leaving his teammates to continue their very important atmospheric harmony analysis and tactical resting. This is where things get interesting. Here's what Professor Zilthak and his four brains never understood about humans. We didn't evolve from prey species. That was their first mistake, and it was a big one. Humans evolved from the species that was just crazy enough to chase down mammoths with pointy sticks, just stubborn enough to figure out agriculture by trial and error, and just vindictive enough to domesticate wolves, because regular dogs weren't intimidating enough. We're not prey. We're the thing that prey species have nightmares about. But Danny? Danny was something special, even by human standards. See, while the consortium had been busy categorizing him as docile and unremarkable, Danny had been using those quiet moments in class to do something they'd never suspected. He'd been studying. Not just the coursework, that was easy enough, but the real curriculum. He'd been learning about every species in the academy, cataloging their strengths, weaknesses, natural habitats, survival strategies, and psychological profiles. That notebook everyone thought was filled with class notes? It was actually a comprehensive xenobiological survival manual, written from the perspective of someone who understood that knowledge was the ultimate survival tool. And XK739? Danny had been researching that particular death world for months. While his teammates were busy establishing their various camps and conducting their very important scientific analyses, Danny was putting 3 years of careful observation and meticulous research to work. He started with the basics: water, shelter, and food in that order. The canyon walls were riddled with caves, most of them probably inhabited by things with more teeth than evolutionary biology textbooks said were strictly necessary, but caves nonetheless. The trick was finding one that was occupied by something he could either avoid or eliminate, depending on the situation. Danny found his cave about 2 hours into the first day. It was currently home to something that looked like a cross between a pangolin and a landmine, covered in bioluminescent scales that probably meant "stay away" in the universal language of things that will kill you. The creature, Danny's notebook identified it as a crystalline burrower, because xenobiologists were apparently as creative with names as they were with safety assessments, was roughly the size of a large dog and had developed the charming habit of exploding when threatened. Perfect. Danny spent the next hour studying the creature's behavioral patterns from a safe distance. It was territorial, aggressive, and had absolutely no interest in sharing its cave with anyone. It was also, Danny noted with interest, completely adapted to XK739's hostile environment. It didn't need the environmental suit technology that every other species relied on. Which gave him an idea. The crystalline burrower's explosion was a chemical reaction triggered by stress hormones when it felt cornered. But like most chemical reactions, it could be manipulated if you understood the catalyst. And Danny, thanks to 3 years of applied xenobiology and his own obsessive research habits, understood the catalyst very well indeed. He opened his survival pack and started making modifications to his equipment. The environmental suit's atmospheric processor used a complex series of filters to make XK739's toxic air breathable. But those same filters could be reverse engineered to produce specific chemical compounds, if you knew what you were doing and were willing to void your warranty. 20 minutes later, Danny had synthesized a compound that would essentially give the crystalline burrower the biological equivalent of a Xanax prescription. Instead of exploding when threatened, it would simply take a very long nap. He delivered the compound via his suit's emergency medical injector, because apparently peaceful solutions still required pointy objects, and waited. The crystalline burrower looked confused for about 30 seconds, then curled up in a corner of the cave and began snoring. The sound was like a Geiger counter having pleasant dreams. Danny now had shelter. Next, water. The problem with XK739's water sources was that they were all trying to kill you in creative ways. The streams contained enough heavy metals to stock a music store. The underground aquifers were contaminated with naturally occurring acids, and the morning dew was technically classified as a mild contact poison. But Danny had spent considerable time studying the planet's geological surveys, and he'd noticed something interesting about the crystalline formations that dominated the landscape. They weren't just pretty rocks. They were actually complex mineral matrices that had evolved to filter and purify various compounds from the environment. In other words, they were natural water purification systems. The trick was finding the right crystals and figuring out how to use them without dying in the process. Most of the crystalline formations were radioactive, but the ones near geothermal vents had been exposed to enough heat and pressure to neutralize the dangerous isotopes while maintaining their filtration properties. Danny spent the rest of the first day constructing what was essentially a crystal-powered water purification system, using his environmental suit's maintenance toolkit and some creative applications of basic chemistry. It wasn't pretty, but it worked, and more importantly, it produced water that wouldn't kill him immediately. He was just finishing the setup when he heard an explosion in the distance. That would be Group 3 then. According to Danny's calculations, and yes, he'd been calculating survival probabilities for every group based on their species composition and behavioral patterns. Group 3 should have encountered the thermal geysers around midday of the first day. The geysers were beautiful, superficially safe, and absolutely perfect for any species that needed to refill their water reserves. They were also pressurized with superheated steam that contained trace amounts of the same neurotoxins that made XK-739's atmosphere so charming. Moderately challenging my ass. Danny made a note in his journal. Day 1, 1400 hours, Group 3 eliminated by environmental hazard as predicted, and continued working on his water purification system. He was just testing the first batch of purified water when his suit's communication system crackled to life. "Human Danny," came Crix's voice, now sounding less like wind chimes and more like wind chimes in a hurricane. "We require assistance. Thorax has experienced complications." Danny looked in the direction of his group's original landing site. Even from 3 kilometers away, he could see the smoke. "Right on schedule." Here's the thing about Keplerians. They're essentially sentient plants, which makes them incredibly good at understanding botanical systems, and completely useless at understanding that not all soil is created equal. Thorax had spent the first day extending his root system deeper and deeper into XK-739's substrate, analyzing mineral compositions and cataloging the various chemical compounds present in the local ecosystem. It was actually quite impressive from a scientific standpoint. His species' natural abilities allowed him to create a real-time chemical map of the immediate area. Unfortunately, one of the chemical compounds he'd analyzed was something the geological survey had missed. A naturally occurring explosive that remained stable until exposed to the specific combination of organic acids that Keplerians produced as part of their root secretion process. In simpler terms, Thorax had accidentally turned himself into a botanical landmine. Danny found what was left of the group's original base camp about 20 minutes later. Crix was floating in agitated circles, his crystalline resonance chambers scattered across the canyon floor. Vex was sitting exactly where Danny had left him, though his tactical rest area was now decorated with chunks of exploded tree person, and his environmental suit was flashing warning indicators about atmospheric contamination. And Thorax was currently distributed across several square kilometers of canyon floor, in what could generously be described as very small pieces. The botanical life form achieved critical mass approximately 30 minutes ago, Crix reported, his translator struggling with what might have been panic, or might have been the Zephyrian equivalent of hysterical laughter. The explosion registered 4.7 on the localized seismic monitoring equipment. Vex looked up from his position in the shade, which was considerably less shady now that their shelter had been vaporized, and made what Danny assumed was a distress sound in his native language. It sounded like a deflating balloon trying to file a complaint. "Our survival probability has decreased substantially," Crix continued. "The atmospheric processors in our environmental suits are now operating at suboptimal efficiency due to particulate contamination. Our shelter has been eliminated, and our botanical specialist has been distributed." Danny surveyed the destruction with the same quiet intensity he'd shown all day. Then he opened his notebook, made another annotation, and looked at his remaining teammates. "Follow me," he said simply. "Where?" Crix asked. Danny smiled that same quiet smile. "Somewhere that won't explode." The cave Danny had liberated from the crystalline burrower was considerably more spacious than it had appeared from the outside. The creature had been busy over the years, excavating a complex network of tunnels that extended deep into the canyon wall. The main chamber was large enough to accommodate all of them comfortably, and the deeper tunnels provided access to the geothermal vents that would keep them warm when XK-739's binary suns decided to take a break. More importantly, the cave system was naturally insulated against most of the planet's environmental hazards. The crystalline burrower species had evolved specifically to survive in XK-739's hostile environment, so their habitat was essentially a ready-made survival shelter. Danny had already set up his water purification system in one of the side chambers, using the natural crystal formations to filter and purify the geothermal runoff. The result was a steady supply of clean water that tasted faintly of minerals and only occasionally glowed in the dark. He'd also established a basic food production system using techniques he'd learned from studying Keplerian agricultural methods. Ironically, many of the same techniques that Thorax had been too specialized to apply outside his own species' parameters. The cave's unique ecosystem supported several varieties of fungi that were technically edible, if you defined edible as probably won't kill you immediately. Crix floated into the main chamber and immediately began setting up his resonance chambers again. This location demonstrates superior survivability metrics, he announced, which Danny assumed was Zephyrian for nice digs. Vex took one look at the warm, sheltered cave with its steady water supply, and immediately claimed a corner for what he called extended tactical recovery. Within minutes, he was asleep, probably dreaming of planets where the primary environmental challenge was choosing between different varieties of comfortable temperatures. Danny settled into his own corner of the cave and opened his notebook again. By his calculations, they were already performing better than 60% of the other groups. The key now was maintaining their advantage and avoiding the mistakes that would eliminate the remaining teams over the next 2 days. Human Danny, Crick said, his resonance chambers humming with what might have been curiosity. Your survival strategies demonstrate remarkable efficiency. This contradicts the behavioral profiles established by our educational supervisors. Danny looked up from his notes. What do you mean? You were classified as a passive participant with limited leadership capabilities. However, your actions since planetfall suggest advanced tactical planning and comprehensive environmental adaptation skills. Here we go. Danny closed his notebook and gave Crix his full attention. What makes you think I'm not passive? Crix's crystalline body shifted through several color combinations that his translator interpreted as various forms of emphasis. You established superior shelter, created functional resource production systems, and successfully predicted the failure modes of multiple other survival groups. These actions require active planning and decisive implementation. Maybe I just got lucky. The probability of achieving this level of success through random chance is approximately 0.003%. Crix replied immediately. My species specializes in probability assessment. You have been planning these actions since before planetfall. Danny was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not the quiet, polite smile his classmates were used to, but something with considerably more teeth. You want to know what I've been doing for the past 3 years? He asked. Affirmative. Danny opened his notebook and showed Crix the pages. Not the careful class notes everyone assumed he was taking, but the real content. Detailed behavioral analyses of every species in the Academy, comprehensive survival strategies for dozens of different planetary environments, and most importantly, complete psychological profiles of every professor and administrator in the consortium's educational system. I've been studying, Danny said simply. All of you. Crix's color patterns shifted to what the translator identified as profound confusion. For what purpose? Because that's what humans do, Danny replied. We adapt. We learn. We figure out how things work, and then we figure out how to make them work better. He flipped to a section near the back of the notebook. Did you know that Professor Zilthak's 4-brain setup makes him incredibly intelligent, but also gives him a psychological blind spot? He literally cannot conceive of intelligence that operates differently from his own. So when he sees a human who doesn't think like a Vortakian, he assumes that human is stupid. Another page flip. Or that Dean Wormek's species evolved from hive-mind insects, which means she instinctively categorizes all behavior as either leadership or following. She can't recognize intelligence that doesn't fit into a hierarchical structure. And another. The entire consortium educational system is designed around the assumption that every species has a fixed set of capabilities determined by their evolutionary background. They can't adapt to the idea that some species, specifically humans, are evolutionary generalists who specialize in adapting to new situations. Crix was very quiet for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his translator had to recalibrate twice to handle the complexity of his response. You have been deliberately concealing your capabilities to avoid administrative attention while conducting comprehensive intelligence gathering on the entire educational establishment. Yep. This level of strategic planning suggests cognitive abilities far beyond the established human baseline. Or maybe, Danny said, closing the notebook, the established baseline was wrong from the beginning. Day 2 of the Death World Survival Assessment began with what the environmental monitors cheerfully described as a moderate seismic event, which translated to, the ground tried to shake everyone to death for about 10 minutes. Danny and his group rode it out in their cave, which proved to be remarkably stable due to the crystalline burrower's instinctive engineering skills. The creature itself slept through the entire earthquake, occasionally making small happy noises that sounded like a Geiger counter purring. Outside, several more groups learned important lessons about the structural integrity of hastily constructed shelters during seismic events. The lessons were brief, educational, and frequently terminal. Day 2's 0630 hours, Danny wrote in his notebook. Seismic activity eliminated groups 5, 8, and 12 as predicted. Estimated remaining participants, 14 groups, approximately 42 individual students. The communication channels were significantly quieter than they had been the day before. Danny spent the morning expanding their water purification system and establishing additional food production areas deeper in the cave system. The geothermal vents provided enough energy to support several different types of edible fungi, and the mineral runoff from the crystal formations created an almost ideal growing medium. By midday, they had enough resources to survive comfortably for weeks, if necessary. "Human Danny?" Crick said, floating over to where Danny was making notes about optimal mushroom harvesting techniques. "I have been analyzing the probability matrices for our continued survival. And? Based on current resource allocation and environmental adaptation, our group has achieved a 97.3% probability of successfully completing the assessment." Danny looked up from his mushrooms. "What's the 2.7% failure chance?" Crick's color patterns shifted to what his translator labeled as academic embarrassment. "Primarily the possibility that you are not actually human, and this entire exercise is some form of advanced psychological experiment." "Okay, that was actually pretty funny. I'm human," Danny assured him. "Just not the kind of human your professors expected." "What kind of human are you?" Danny considered the question carefully. How do you explain to an alien intelligence that humans aren't just another species with fixed evolutionary parameters? How do you describe the fundamental adaptability that made humans capable of surviving everywhere from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests to the vacuum of space? "The kind that pays attention," he said finally. Their conversation was interrupted by a proximity alarm from Danny's environmental suit. Something large was moving around outside the cave entrance. Danny checked his suit's external sensors and smiled. "Right on schedule." "What is causing the alarm?" Crick asked, his resonance chambers shifting to what might have been a defensive configuration. "Lunch," Danny replied, gathering his equipment. "The thing about death worlds is that everything evolving on them has to be incredibly efficient at staying alive, which usually means they're also incredibly efficient at making other things dead. XK-739's apex predator was something the survey team had designated a thermal hunter, essentially a cross between a grizzly bear, a heat-seeking missile, and a very bad attitude. Thermal hunters were roughly 3 meters long, covered in scales that could withstand direct contact with molten rock, and equipped with sensory organs that could detect body heat from several kilometers away. They were also highly territorial, extremely aggressive, and had been known to attack environmental suits just because they didn't like the way the atmospheric processors hummed. In other words, they were perfect. Danny had been tracking this particular thermal hunter since the middle of the first day. It had been systematically hunting the various student groups, eliminating anyone who was careless enough to establish camp in its territory. So far, it had accounted for at least 3 group eliminations, and Danny estimated it would probably claim 2 or 3 more before the assessment ended. Unless someone did something about it. The creature was currently investigating the area around their cave entrance, probably drawn by the heat signatures from their environmental suits. Its sensory organs were incredibly sophisticated. It could distinguish between different types of heat sources, track individual movement patterns, and even detect changes in body temperature that indicated stress or fear. But like most apex predators, it had evolved to hunt prey that followed predictable patterns. It expected its targets to either run away in panic or freeze in terror. It didn't expect them to come outside and offer it a snack. Danny stepped out of the cave entrance carrying a small container of synthesized chemicals. The thermal hunter immediately focused on him, its sensory organs locking onto his heat signature like targeting radar. It was actually quite beautiful in a way. Its scales shifted color as it moved, creating a camouflage pattern that made it almost invisible against the crystalline canyon walls. It was also approximately twice as large as the survey reports had indicated, which suggested it had been feeding very well during the assessment. "Hello there," Danny said politely, as if he were greeting a neighbor's dog instead of a 3-meter death machine. "I have something for you." The thermal hunter tilted its head, probably confused by the complete lack of fear in Danny's voice. Its species had evolved to interpret emotional states through biochemical signatures, and Danny's complete calm was likely outside its normal parameters. Danny opened the container and poured its contents onto the ground between himself and the creature. The synthesized compounds were a modified version of the same chemical cocktail he'd used on the crystalline burrower, but adjusted for the thermal hunter's different biochemistry. Instead of inducing sleep, this mixture would create a state of euphoric satisfaction, essentially convincing the creature's nervous system that it had just eaten the most satisfying meal of its life. The thermal hunter approached the chemical puddle cautiously, its sensory organs analyzing the compounds. Then it began to drink. Within minutes, the apex predator of XK-739 was lying on its back in the afternoon sun, making happy rumbling noises, and occasionally waving its feet in the air like an enormous scaly puppy. Danny made another note in his journal. Day 2, 12:30 hours. Apex predator neutralized through biochemical modification. Estimated reduction in casualty rate for remaining groups, 73%. He was just finishing his notes when his suit's communication system activated. "Attention, all assessment participants," came Professor Zilthak's voice, transmitted from the orbital monitoring station. "We are experiencing technical difficulties with our environmental monitoring systems. Several groups appear to have achieved impossible survival metrics." Danny's smile widened. "Oh, this is going to be fun." The problem, from the consortium's perspective, was that their carefully designed Death World assessment was producing all the wrong results. XK-739 was supposed to eliminate roughly 60% of the participants within the first 48 hours. The survivors were supposed to be struggling desperately with basic resource management, competing aggressively for limited supplies, and demonstrating the stress responses that would validate the consortium's behavioral models. Instead, casualty rates were running nearly 20% below projections. Several groups were reporting resource surpluses, and the stress indicators from the environmental suits were showing patterns that the monitoring computers couldn't interpret. Most disturbing of all, the human-designated Danny Erickson was showing readings that suggested he was actually enjoying himself. Professor Zilthak stared at the monitoring displays with all 4 of his brains working overtime. The data simply didn't make sense. How could a species classified as adequate generalists be outperforming students from civilizations that had been spacefaring for millennia? "Perhaps our human behavioral models require revision," suggested his research assistant, a young Keplerian who had been taking notes throughout the assessment. "Impossible," Zilthak replied immediately. "The models were developed through 3 years of direct observation. Humans are emotionally volatile, conflict-prone, and dependent on technology for survival in hostile environments. These readings must represent equipment malfunction." The assistant rustled his leaves in what might have been disagreement. "The equipment appears to be functioning normally. All other species are producing expected results." Zilthak examined the data streams more carefully. Group 7, the humans group, was not only surviving but thriving. Their resource acquisition rates were off the charts, their shelter stability was rating higher than some permanent installations, and their stress indicators suggested they were more relaxed than most students during regular classroom activities. "Run a detailed analysis of Group 7's activity patterns," he ordered. "I want to know exactly what they're doing down there." The results came back 20 minutes later and made absolutely no sense. According to the sensor data, Group 7 had established a complex resource production facility, neutralized 3 separate categories of environmental hazards, and somehow convinced the local apex predator to take up residence outside their shelter as a guard animal. "A guard animal, on a death world. This is clearly a sensor malfunction," Zilthak announced. "Prepare an emergency extraction team. We need to retrieve Group 7 for detailed examination." Which was exactly what Danny had been waiting for. The thing about humans that really confused other species was our relationship with danger. Most intelligent species had evolved sophisticated risk avoidance mechanisms. They saw danger and instinctively tried to get as far away from it as possible. Humans, on the other hand, had evolved the opposite response. We saw danger and thought, "I wonder how that works," or "I bet I could make that more dangerous," or "Hold my beer and watch this." It's not that we don't understand risk. We're actually quite good at calculating probabilities and assessing threats. It's just that somewhere in our evolutionary development, we'd apparently decided that the appropriate response to danger was to poke it with a stick and see what happened. Which brings us to Danny's plan for Day 3 of the assessment. He'd been monitoring the communication channels since the beginning, tracking the elimination patterns and calculating survival probabilities for each remaining group. By his estimates, there were currently 8 groups left, with a total of maybe 24 students still active. The assessment was supposed to end at 0800 hours on Day 3, with extraction teams retrieving the survivors. But Danny had been paying attention to the subtle changes in the communication protocols, and he'd noticed something interesting. The monitoring station was preparing for early extraction. They were going to end the assessment 12 hours ahead of schedule. "That's cheating," Danny told Crix, who was floating near the cave entrance, keeping an eye on their domesticated thermal hunter. The creature was currently engaged in what appeared to be a grooming routine, using its claws to polish its scales while making contented rumbling noises. "How is early extraction considered cheating?" Crix asked. Danny opened his notebook to a page near the back. "The assessment parameters specifically state that students will be evaluated on their ability to survive for 72 hours. Early extraction changes the fundamental nature of the test. But why would the administrators choose to modify the assessment parameters?" "Because the results don't match their expectations," Danny replied. They expected most of the humans to be eliminated within the first day. Instead, humans are accounting for 40% of the remaining survivors. He flipped to another page. More importantly, they expected me to be eliminated first. I was supposed to be the proof of concept for their behavioral models, the weak, passive human who couldn't adapt to a hostile environment. Crick's color patterns shifted through several configurations that his translator struggled to interpret. You are not weak or passive. No, Danny agreed. I'm really not. He closed the notebook and looked at his teammates. Crix, floating in his corner with his resonance chambers humming softly. Vex, still engaged in his extended tactical rest but now looking considerably more comfortable thanks to the cave's amenities. Even the crystalline burrower, curled up in its alcove, snoring its radioactive snores. And outside, their guard thermal hunter, probably the most feared predator on XK-739, now essentially a very large, very dangerous pet. What are you planning, human Danny? Crix asked. Danny smiled his real smile, the one with teeth. I'm going to teach them something about human behavioral models. The extraction team arrived at 0200 hours, 12 hours ahead of the official schedule. They came in fast and quiet, using stealth shuttles and expecting to find exhausted, desperate survivors huddled in makeshift shelters. What they found instead was Danny sitting outside the cave entrance, calmly writing in his notebook while a 3-meter apex predator dozed contentedly at his feet. The extraction team, a mix of consortium security personnel from various species, stopped their shuttles about 50 meters away and spent several minutes trying to figure out what they were looking at. Target appears to be uninjured and in stable condition, the team leader reported back to the monitoring station. However, there appears to be some kind of indigenous predator in the immediate vicinity. Can you eliminate the threat? Came Professor Zilthak's voice over the communication channel. Danny looked up from his notebook and waved cheerfully at the extraction team. Then he reached over and scratched the thermal hunter behind what might have been ears. The creature made a happy rumbling noise and rolled onto its back to facilitate better scratching access. Negative on threat elimination, the team leader reported, his voice carrying what sounded suspiciously like confusion. The predator appears to be domesticated. There was a long pause from the monitoring station. Repeat that, Professor Zilthak's voice came back, all 4 of his brains apparently struggling with the concept. The indigenous apex predator is exhibiting domesticated behavior patterns. The human target appears to have established a symbiotic relationship with it. Danny stood up, brushing dust off his environmental suit, and walked toward the extraction team. The thermal hunter followed him like an enormous scaly dog, occasionally bumping against his leg in what was clearly affectionate behavior. Good morning, Danny called out politely. You're early. The assessment isn't supposed to end for another 12 hours. The team leader, a Vortakian with the kind of bureaucratic bearing that suggested middle management, consulted his data pad. We're conducting emergency extraction due to equipment malfunction. Please prepare for immediate transport. What kind of equipment malfunction? Danny asked, still approaching. The thermal hunter kept pace beside him, its heat-detecting organs swiveling to examine the new arrivals with curious interest. The monitoring systems are reporting impossible survival metrics from several groups, the team leader replied. The assessment parameters appear to have been compromised. Danny stopped about 10 meters from the lead shuttle and smiled that quiet smile again. Or maybe your parameters were wrong to begin with. Behind him, Crix emerged from the cave entrance, floating serenely with his resonance chambers creating soft, harmonious tones. Vex appeared a moment later, looking more rested than he had since the assessment began. Even the crystalline burrower poked its head out of the cave, blinking sleepily in the morning light. The extraction team took in the scene. A well-rested human, his obviously healthy alien teammates, their comfortable shelter, and their domesticated apex predator. It was exactly the opposite of what they'd expected to find. How? The team leader asked, apparently abandoning official protocols in favor of genuine curiosity. Danny opened his notebook one last time. By paying attention, he said simply. Your species have been studying the galaxy for thousands of years, cataloging every planet, analyzing every ecosystem, and developing comprehensive databases about environmental hazards and survival strategies. He flipped through several pages of detailed notes. But you've been thinking about it all wrong. You see a death world and assume it's trying to kill you. You see an apex predator and assume it's your enemy. You see harsh environmental conditions and assume they're obstacles to overcome. Another page flip. Humans don't think that way. We see a death world and think, this is just Earth with the difficulty turned up. We see an apex predator and think, I wonder if it likes having its belly scratched. We see harsh environmental conditions and think, these are just engineering problems waiting to be solved. The team leader looked at his data pad, then at the domesticated thermal hunter, then back at Danny. You're saying humans are naturally adapted to hostile environments? I'm saying humans are naturally adapted to adaptation, Danny replied. We're not the strongest species, or the smartest, or the most technologically advanced. But we're the species that figured out how to survive everywhere from Arctic wastelands to tropical jungles to the vacuum of space, using nothing but our brains and our stubborn refusal to accept that anything is impossible. He closed the notebook with a definitive snap. Your behavioral models were based on the assumption that humans are just another specialized species with fixed capabilities. But that's not what we are. We're evolutionary generalists who specialize in figuring things out. The communication channel crackled to life with Professor Zilthak's voice. Extraction team, report status immediately. The team leader looked at Danny, then at the peaceful scene around the cave, then at his datapad full of impossible readings. Finally, he activated his transmitter. Mission parameters require revision, he reported. The human subjects appear to have exceeded all baseline expectations. The debriefing session back at the academy was interesting. Danny sat in the center of a semicircular amphitheater, surrounded by professors, researchers, and administrators from across the consortium. His notebook lay open on the table in front of him, its pages filled with 3 years' worth of careful observations and meticulous planning. Professor Ziltak dominated the central position, all 4 of his brains working overtime to process what he'd witnessed. Dean Warmack flanked him on one side, her compound eyes reflecting light in patterns that suggested deep thought. The rest of the faculty filled out the remaining seats, representing dozens of species and academic disciplines. They all looked like they were trying to solve a puzzle that had too many pieces. Let me see if I understand this correctly, Professor Zilthak began, his voice carrying the particular tone that academics use when reality has failed to conform to their theories. You spent 3 years deliberately underperforming in classroom settings while conducting comprehensive intelligence gathering on every species in the academy. That's right, Danny confirmed. You then used this intelligence to develop specialized survival strategies for a death world assessment that was designed to eliminate 70% of participants. Yep. And in the process, you not only ensured your own survival, but also significantly improved the survival rates of other groups by neutralizing environmental hazards. Danny considered this for a moment. I wouldn't say I was trying to help the other groups. I just didn't see any point in letting preventable deaths happen when a little applied chemistry could solve the problem. Dean Warmack leaned forward, her translator rendering her pheromone-based communication into audible speech. The thermal hunter neutralization alone reduced projected casualty rates by over 70%. You essentially eliminated the primary threat to all remaining participants. It seemed like the efficient thing to do, Danny replied. The creature was operating on instinct. It wasn't evil, just following its programming. A few synthetic neurotransmitters and suddenly it's everyone's friend instead of everyone's nightmare. Professor Ziltak's 4 brains were clearly struggling with this concept. But your species profile indicates that humans are territorial and competitive. You should have been focused on ensuring your own group's survival at the expense of others. Danny looked around the amphitheater at all the confused alien faces staring at him. Then he started laughing. Not the quiet, polite chuckle his classmates were used to, but genuine, full-throated human laughter. You really don't get it, do you? He said, still chuckling. You've been studying us for 3 years, and you still don't understand the most basic thing about human psychology. Enlighten us, Dean Warmack said dryly. Danny stood up and walked to the central display screen, where the assessment data was still being analyzed. Survival rates, resource allocation charts, behavioral pattern matrices, all the carefully quantified measurements that the consortium used to understand species capabilities. You see competition where we see cooperation, he said, pointing to the data streams. You see territorial behavior where we see community building. You see aggression where we see problem solving. He turned back to face the assembled faculty. Humans aren't competitive because we want to beat everyone else. We're competitive because we want everyone to get better. We don't neutralize threats just to protect ourselves. We neutralize threats because we can't stand watching other people suffer when we could do something about it. Professor Ziltak's translator was working overtime to process the concept. You're saying that human territorial instincts are actually altruistic? I'm saying that human territorial instincts evolved to protect the tribe, not just the individual, Danny replied. And to humans, everyone is potentially part of the tribe. We don't see other species as competition. We see them as teammates we haven't gotten to know yet. He walked back to his seat and picked up his notebook. 3 years ago, when I first arrived at this academy, you classified me as adequate and passive, because I didn't fit your models for intelligence or leadership. But I wasn't being passive, I was being patient. I wasn't underperforming, I was learning. Danny opened the notebook to the first page, where he'd written a single sentence on his first day of classes. Figure out how it all works. Every species in the galaxy has some kind of specialization, he continued. Zephyrians float and analyze probability. Vortakians think with multiple parallel processors. Keplerians photosynthesize and understand botanical systems. Everyone has their thing. He looked around the amphitheater again, making eye contact with as many faculty members as possible. Humans specialize in figuring out how everyone else's specializations work, and then figuring out how to make them work together. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that happens when an entire worldview shifts on its axis. Finally, Dean Wormick spoke up. You're suggesting that human intelligence is fundamentally collaborative rather than competitive. I'm not suggesting it, Danny replied. I'm proving it. Check the assessment data again, not just for my group, but for all the surviving groups. How many of them benefited from the environmental modifications I made? Professor Ziltak consulted his datapad, his four brains working through the calculations. Approximately 87% of surviving participants were positively affected by your actions. And did those improvements reduce my group's competitive advantage? Actually, no. Your group maintained the highest survival probability throughout the assessment. Danny smiled. That's because helping others succeed doesn't make you weaker. It makes everyone stronger. And when everyone is stronger, the whole system works better. He closed the notebook and looked directly at Professor Ziltak. You want to know what humans really are? We're the species that figured out how to turn a death world into a garden, how to make friends with apex predators, and how to turn a survival competition into a collaborative success story. Another long silence filled the amphitheater. So, Danny continued, are you going to update your behavioral models, or are you going to keep pretending that adequate generalists just got lucky? The academic paper that resulted from Danny's assessment performance was titled Reconsidering Human Psychological Profiles, Evidence for Collaborative Adaptation Strategies, and became the most downloaded publication in the consortium's database within 6 months of its release. Professor Ziltak, to his credit, revised his entire curriculum based on the findings. The new human behavioral model classified the species as adaptive collaborators with exceptional environmental modification capabilities and systematic altruistic tendencies. Dean Wormack established a new academic program called Interspecies Cooperation Studies and appointed Danny as the first human professor in the consortium's history. His first lecture, titled Why Death Worlds Are Just Friendship Opportunities You Haven't Met Yet, was standing room only.